Remains, Chapter 5. A little before 3 p.m., Emily and Nick arrived at Pine Tree Slopes. She and Nick pulled up to the site where an officer stood guard on the opposite end of a single plot-sized perimeter, sectioned off by yellow caution tape. Emily exited Nick's patrol car, still in Joe's heels and black dress. After 3 wobbly steps over the gravel driveway, Nick reached out and grabbed Emily's arm to steady her. This wasn't going to work. "Do you maybe have an extra pair of tennis shoes or boots or something in the trunk?" she said. "I do, but they're going to be huge on you." "Not sure I have a choice. I'll never make it in these, and we just don't have time for me to go back home and change." The weather had shifted from a beautiful, cloudless day to a fairly stiff wind coming off from the north. It had dropped the temp a good 10 degrees, and the sky was filling with bottom-heavy dark gray clouds. They still had several hours of daylight, but this storm would beset them in less than an hour. Emily was certain. Nick pulled out an old pair of golf shoes and dirty socks. Emily stuffed the socks into the tops of the shoes and slid her bare feet in. She pulled the laces as tight as she could, but the shoes barely snugged around her narrow size 7 feet. To walk, Emily had to lift her feet a little higher than usual, but she was able to clod her way toward the home site. Only she and Nick entered the cordoned area. Someone had planted a stake with an orange plastic flag at the site where the bones had been found. Emily and Nick made their way over as the wind picked up and a flicker of lightning flashed, sending a shiver along Emily's arms. She began to count, a habit from her childhood. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3 Mississippi, 4 Mississippi, 5 Mississippi, 6 Mississippi. A faint rumble of thunder sounded in the distance. They were racing against time. The storm was only about a mile away. "Rain's coming soon. Does anyone have a tarp we can set up?" she called out to the officers and construction crew who had lined up along the perimeter to watch. "We got one," one of their crew yelled back, running off to fetch it. Emily turned back to the site. The first thing she could see was a mandible and partial cranium jutting out from the crusty red soil. Her eyes wandered south from the skull and spied several phalanges, long like fingers, definitely not toes. Nothing else protruded from the earth. Emily knelt down, immediately soiling the hem of the dress. As she bent over to brush away some of the dirt around the skull, the bodice of her dress tightened across her rib cage. She tried to exhale carefully, but felt a tiny rip on the side seam. "Sorry, Joe. I'm going to owe you a new black dress. Hope you weren't too attached to this one." She gently swept away the dirt around the mandible until she could see that it was attached to the calvarium. The teeth were in near perfect condition, and definitely human. She knew there were differences between the shapes of the male and female jaw, but she wasn't trained well enough to make this call. They would need to get a forensic anthropologist for an official determination. "Nick, we're going to need something to collect this." She looked up at him with a straight face. "Not a deer, huh?" She shook her head. "Human." He paused for a moment, and she noticed again the color draining from his face. "You okay?" She might have expected this look from a more gruesome death scene, but there was nothing gory about a couple of teeth. Yeah, I've got evidence collecting kits and a roll of heavy-duty trash bags in the car." "That'll have to do. Oh, and a small shovel and a paintbrush would be ideal. I'll see what I can find. Maybe some of the guys have brushes." Nick raced back to the squad car as Emily continued to carefully excavate. Soon she had the entire skull exposed, except for the back, which was still resting in the dirt. She could also see that the skull was attached to a vertebral column. They were lucky. A full skeleton would make identification easier. The lightning flashed again overhead, and thunder rumbled again, growing closer, louder. 2 construction men returned with a blue tarp and began to stake the ground to install it. "Careful, please," Emily instructed. "We have no idea if this body is fully intact. Bones may be spread nearby." Still using her hands, Emily scraped away at the dirt clinging to the neck bones. She noticed a fissure in 2 of them. Until further examination at the morgue under good light and perhaps a magnifying lens, it would be impossible to know if the fractures had happened at death or after death. The construction guys were now struggling to secure the posts for the tarp, fighting against the wind whipping through the construction site, harpooning sticks and leaves through the air. One of them held the edge of the tarp while the other secured it to the poles. Emily hunched her back toward the wind as Nick ran up with his arms loaded with equipment. He laid everything out a few feet from where Emily was working. By now the tarp was overhead, and the thunderclaps were rolling in one behind the other. One of the construction guys ran over with a handful of paintbrushes and a small shovel. Emily thanked him, and she and Nick got to work, gingerly but quickly, digging and sweeping away at the bones. "You realize the county's going to need to hire a forensic anthropologist," said Emily, after they had uncovered the cervical bones and a shoulder blade. "How long do you think this body has been here?" he asked. "I don't know, honestly. It could be several months to many years, since it's fully skeletonized. The bones are in fairly good condition. That could mean it's younger, or it was buried deep enough that critters weren't able to get to it." They worked for a few more minutes in silence. Emily could tell something was troubling Nick by the way he held his furrowed brow in concentration. His brush strokes were soft and swift, but Emily noticed a slight quiver in his hands. "Do you feel okay?" she said, when he stopped and sat back on his heels with a big exhale. "No, I'm kind of queasy," he said, rocking back to a cross-legged position on the ground. The wind howled above through the treetops, pelting more small branches and leaves onto the tarp. "Are you going to be sick?" "No, it's not that kind of sick. Low blood sugar, maybe." Lightning flashed closer, illuminating the whole site. The crack of thunder that followed made Emily jump. They were losing time. She needed him back to work. "Take a couple deep breaths and get back in here, Larson. This storm's about to hit, and we need to get this out of here." I know, I'm sorry." Nick drew in a breath and squatted again. "It's just, I think I know who these bones belong to." "What?" yelled Emily through the wind. "Sandy Parkman." "Who?" "A girl from high school, do you remember?" "Not really." The name was vaguely familiar, but she couldn't place her. "She went missing 10 years ago. I'm just wondering if this might be her." "These exact bones. How can you be so sure?" Emily challenged. Until a forensic anthropologist examined them, they would not know for certain if the bones were male or female, how old they were, or from what race of people the bones belonged. From what she could tell so far, they looked small, not adult size, but she was not a bone expert, and it would be crucial to get a complete and proper identification in case this investigation ended up in court. Always good to have an expert second opinion. "I just have a feeling," Nick yelled back. Sandy Parkman. A vague recollection gathered in her mind. "Was she the girl who lived in the little rundown house down the street from you?" Nick had grown up in the country, so down the street really meant a quarter mile to the next residence. "Yeah. What would Sandy's bones be doing out here?" "You never heard what happened?" His voice rose above the wind. Emily shook her head without looking up. They had uncovered the skeleton to the hip bones, which Emily found detached from the femur. She started to place the bones in the thick black garbage bags Nick had brought. "Well, I guess this would have been 2 years after you left Freeport. She left home one spring day after school and no one ever saw her again," said Nick. Emily made a quick calculation. Emily had left Freeport when she was 16. That was the last time she had seen Nick, too. Now she was nearly 28. "That's awful, I'm sorry." "You know, I used to take her home from school now and then. She was a sophomore and I was a senior, and she didn't have her driver's license, but a lot of times her boyfriend would drive her, you know? This one day she came up to me at my locker after lunch and asked if I could take her home from school." Thunder cracked louder overhead and shook the ground, rattling Emily's organs. "This is turning into one nasty storm." Emily picked up the pace on her digging. No anthropologist would have approved of her technique, but she didn't want rain or wind washing away potential evidence. "I drove her home that day and never saw her again," said Nick. His digging paused as he stared at the femur bone emerging from the soil. "You're making pretty big assumptions here. Keep those to yourself until we get those bones identified. They may not be Sandy's remains at all." Emily wanted to impress on Nick that he shouldn't start any rumors a hungry press might pick up on and feed from, like they had with the Julie Dobson case. Speaking of the press, she was surprised they hadn't descended on their investigation already. This was a juicy discovery, and storm or no storm, hungry news hunters would be eager to swarm in. Perhaps Nick had learned from the Dobson case and demanded this stay under wraps. A bolt of lightning zapped the forest floor 50 feet from their makeshift tent as a deafening crack of thunder gave her insides another good stir. They had to hurry. Emily glanced over to Nick's section again. He was still digging away around the right femur. Emily lent her help, and they were able to slide the bones securely into the bag. "We don't have much time," Emily yelled, wedging her shovel into the dirt on the outside of the right tibia that had emerged from the soil. The temperature had dropped another 5 degrees, hovering just above the freezing point. Emily shivered in Jo's short dress and her red jacket. She put it out of her mind and kept digging. Nick and Emily huddled in the center to keep cover, guarding the collection kits and trash bags of bones the best they could on their laps. The water streamed into the crevices and craters where the bones had been, creating a massive muddy puddle around Nick and Emily. Wet and cold, her shoes now covered in slippery mud clay, Emily resigned herself to the elements and inwardly celebrated their successful excavation. She hugged her arms around her sides and felt another tear in the seam of Jo's dress under her red jacket. It was already completely ruined by mud, so what did one more tear matter? Besides, she could breathe more easily now. She looked at Nick, who seemed far away in his thoughts, as he clawed at the muddy ground to extract another bone. The wind howled above them, and the trees shook down leaves and branches. She glanced up at the sky. The grayish-green clouds churned in a circular formation above them. Nick followed her gaze, his eyes widening with alarm. "We need to get out of here," Nick yelled over the rush of wind. "We're going to get killed." "Keep digging." She was able to release the tibia and handed it to Nick to place in the bag. The foot was buried deeper, and she had to excavate with more care and precision. Working in tandem, they made tiny stabs with the tip of the shovel while Nick brushed away the dirt. Soon they were able to loosen the foot. Then an eerie stillness broke over the woods, and a faint scream, like a fast-approaching train, pealed in the distance. She and Nick exchanged a panicked look. They had only minutes to clear out before the twister touched down. They had just enough time to make it to Nick's patrol car with the bones when the tornado's fully formed funnel dipped down over the treetops, snapping thick branches like toothpicks and hurtling them through the forest like javelins. "Get down!" Nick shouted as they both flattened to the floor of the patrol car, and he covered Emily's head and back with his torso the best he could. Branches plunked and thudded all around outside Nick's patrol car. Emily tried not to imagine how much damage was being inflicted and prayed none of the trees would fall and crush them. The tornado's terror lasted less than a minute, but it felt like an hour. Then, as if someone had turned off a turbofan in a warehouse, the wind instantly stopped. Emily and Nick didn't move a muscle as they listened to the last few small stray branches tumble from heights to plink against the patrol car. Soon, it was quiet. A sliver of sun and a bird's chirp finally drew them from the patrol car, where they got their first look at the damage. Nick went immediately to check on the construction workers, but found all of them had already evacuated the site to seek shelter. Smart guys. Emily scanned their surroundings and spied their tent tarp wrapped around the cab of the backhoe. Branches, full tree limbs, littered every square inch of the forest floor. More stunning to her was that oddly patterned patches of full-grown trees lay felled in crisscross arrangement all around them. Nick's patrol car had been narrowly spared. She and Nick picked a path toward the site of the bones, where they had been just minutes ago. A giant oak tree lay across it. They shared a terrified, grateful look. They had been lucky to survive. Really lucky. "Are your limbs intact?" Nick asked. "Pun intended," said Emily, and they shared a nervous laugh. They looked over the bone excavation site in silence. Emily could tell he was thinking about Sandy. "Do you think she ran away?" "I told myself that because she had it rough. Jealous, controlling boyfriend, tough home life. In my mind, I guess I wanted to believe she left to find a fresh new start," said Nick. Emily could tell from the distance in his look that his mind was replaying the memories of that day. "What did you do when you learned she was gone?" "Not enough." She let the moment hang, hoping he might expound on his memories. When he didn't elaborate, she broke the silence. "Once we can get this body to the morgue, we'll need to arrange for a forensic anthropologist." "What's that?" She had drawn him from his thoughts. "Why do you need that?" "Because I'm not a bone expert. You need a forensic anthropologist on this case. Someone who can properly identify the victim. I know bodies, not so much old bones. University of Michigan has a great program. Give them a call and have them send their best and brightest, she said, wiping a strand of wet hair away from her forehead. She must look a mess. Fair enough, I'll call. He was snippy and distracted, a common defense mechanism for hiding one's true emotions. I know how you're feeling about this, Nick. I can't imagine the burden you've been under. I just know it's her. It might not be, she tossed back at him, then softened some. You have the power to do something really important here, because that body belongs to someone who's been missing for a long time, Sandy or not. That's a detective win-win, right? Let's get the remains to the morgue, said Nick. That was Nick at his raw core. A practical protector, a fighter for the underdog, a relentless champion for the vulnerable. She wished she had trusted him with her secret when she was 15. Things might have turned out so differently if she had. As Emily looked west to the bright red and orange sky that held a sinking sun, its last light filled the woods and made the raindrops on the fall leaves glow like twinkle lights. She was kissed by a memory of something her father used to say. No matter how grim the day, there is always beauty if you just open your eyes to it.